The hum of the engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats, some excited for the journey ahead, others simply relieved to finally be on their way. Among them was a well-dressed couple who had worked hard for the privilege of sitting in first class. They smiled politely, ticket stubs in hand, as they approached their seats. But before they could settle in, a member of the airline crew stepped forward, blocking their path. The tone was sharp, the expression dismissive. Without asking many questions, the crew insisted they did not belong there. The couple exchanged confused glances, their voices calm but firm as they explained that their tickets were indeed for first class. Still, the response was cold and unyielding. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked away, pretending not to notice, while others leaned in, curious about the growing tension. The couple remained composed, though it was clear the humiliation cut deep. They weren't just travelers seeking comfort on a long flight. They were professionals, respected in their field, carrying with them a quiet authority that the crew knew nothing about. The irony hung heavy in the air. The very people being told they weren't fit for first class held more influence over the airline industry than anyone on board could imagine. The crew had no idea that the man quietly gripping his wife's hand carried power linked directly to the Federal Aviation Administration. Power that could determine policies, careers, and reputations. Still, they stayed silent for now. As the crew grew more insistent, passengers shifted uneasily, sensing the conflict was about to erupt into something bigger. What began as an unfair dismissal was about to turn into a lesson that no one on that flight would ever forget. And the next moment changed everything. The air inside the cabin seemed to thicken as the couple remained standing in the aisle, tickets still visible in the husband's hand. His name was Marcus, a man who carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that came from years of dedication and responsibility. Beside him was his wife, Alana, equally poised, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. They were used to traveling often, but never had they been confronted in this way, stripped of dignity in front of strangers who knew nothing about them. The flight attendant, perhaps under pressure or simply acting on assumption, continued to insist that the seats were reserved for eligible passengers. The words stung, and though spoken in a controlled voice, they carried an edge that made the moment all the more humiliating. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others stared openly, waiting to see how far the standoff would go. Marcus could have raised his voice, could have pulled out his credentials then and there, but he didn't. Alana placed a gentle hand on his arm, silently reminding him that patience was its own kind of power. What the crew didn't know was that Marcus had spent years working closely with aviation safety and compliance, a role directly connected with the FAA. He understood the system better than most, and he knew every detail of airline regulations, from boarding rights to passenger treatment. But this wasn't just about rules. It was about respect, about how quickly people judged without knowing the story behind a face. Alana scanned the first-class cabin, noticing empty seats that clearly matched their boarding passes. She wondered how long they would be forced to stand there, held in limbo between what was fair and what was being imposed on them. The tension in the cabin only grew heavier, as though everyone sensed the storm was far from over. The captain's announcement echoed faintly over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board, but the words barely registered. The real focus of the cabin was still on Marcus and Alana, who remained caught in the awkward standoff. The flight attendant now had backup, another crew member stepping in, their body language making it clear they were siding with their colleague without even checking the facts. It wasn't just about 2 seats anymore. It was about authority, perception, and a refusal to listen. Marcus kept his voice steady, explaining once again that their tickets were correct. He even offered to show the digital confirmation from his phone, but the attendant shook their head dismissively. Passengers in economy craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening in first class. Whispers spread. Some assumed the couple must have made a mistake, while others weren't so sure. Alana felt the sting of every stare, but she also noticed something else. A man in a business suit seated a few rows back, watching with interest. His expression wasn't one of judgment but curiosity, as if he knew this was more than it appeared. She wondered who he was and why he seemed so invested in the unfolding drama. The conflict was no longer private. A young mother holding her child looked toward Marcus with empathy, while a group of frequent flyers exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone could sense the situation was spiraling into something larger, something that touched on fairness, dignity, and hidden truths. What the crew failed to realize was that their rigid insistence wasn't just inconveniencing two passengers, it was creating ripples that could come back to haunt them. Marcus and Alana stood quietly, but beneath the silence was a storm waiting to break, one that would shake the entire airline to its core. The cabin had grown so quiet that even the steady hum of the engines seemed louder than usual. Every eye was locked on the confrontation, though most passengers tried to disguise their interest behind half-turned heads or nervous whispers. Marcus stood tall, his ticket still in hand, refusing to move to coach as the crew demanded. Alana, though calm on the surface, could feel her heart beating faster with every second of the humiliation. The second crew member crossed their arms and muttered something about escalating the issue. That phrase caught Marcus's attention. He knew exactly what it meant. Calling in the captain, maybe even involving security once they landed. A rush of unease spread through the passengers as they realized the situation wasn't going to disappear quietly. The couple wasn't backing down, and the crew wasn't willing to admit they might be wrong. The suited man who had been watching finally leaned forward in his seat, as if he was debating whether to step in. His eyes met Marcus's for a brief moment, and Marcus gave the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement that he was aware of being observed. Alana noticed too, and for the first time, she wondered if this stranger somehow recognized who they were. Meanwhile, tension boiled over among the passengers. Some whispered words of support, while others looked uncomfortable, wishing the flight would simply take off. A teenager with earbuds pulled one out, staring wide-eyed at the scene. Even the young mother shifted uneasily, hugging her child a little closer, as though sensing the weight of something bigger than just a seating dispute. The air felt charged, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. Marcus finally lowered his ticket, his voice quiet but steady as he prepared to say something that would stop the cabin cold. The moment hung in the air, right at the edge of breaking. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but before a word could leave his lips, the suited man in the back of first class suddenly stood. His presence commanded attention instantly, and the passengers shifted their gaze from the couple to him. He cleared his throat, calm but deliberate, and addressed the crew. "Are you certain you want to continue this course of action?" His tone was sharp enough to cut through the silence, yet controlled, carrying weight that made the flight attendants pause. The crew exchanged nervous glances, caught off guard. They hadn't expected interference, let alone from someone who clearly wasn't an average passenger. Alana studied him carefully, realizing this wasn't just a curious onlooker. This was someone who knew the system, maybe even more than they did. Marcus narrowed his eyes, his instincts telling him this man was connected to the airline or aviation industry in a way the crew would regret ignoring. Passengers leaned in closer, some holding their breath, waiting for an explanation. The tension doubled. This wasn't just a fight for two seats anymore. It was turning into a confrontation between unseen powers. The suited man slid a badge halfway from his wallet, flashing it briefly before tucking it away. Not everyone caught the detail, but those who did gasped softly, recognizing the insignia tied directly to aviation oversight. The crew stiffened, but instead of stepping back, one of them doubled down, insisting the couple was still in the wrong. That stubbornness shocked the onlookers, fueling whispers about arrogance and abuse of authority. Alana felt the weight of the moment. She and Marcus weren't just standing for themselves anymore, they were now symbols of something larger. The plane hadn't moved an inch, yet the cabin felt like a courtroom, a stage, and a battlefield all at once. And as Marcus finally lifted his head to speak, everyone braced for the truth that was about to shake the flight beyond anything they imagined. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority that silenced the whispers around him. "You've made a serious mistake," he said, his gaze fixed on the crew. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his credentials. The cabin seemed to freeze as the unmistakable seal of the FAA caught the light. Gasps echoed through first class, passengers leaning forward to see more clearly. Even those in economy strained to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The crew's faces drained of color. Their insistence, their dismissive words, all of it now hung heavy in the air. Marcus explained, not loudly but firmly, that he was part of the FAA's oversight board, the very body that reviewed airline practices and passenger rights. Alana held her head high, her composure unshaken, as the realization rippled across the cabin. Every decision the crew had made in those tense minutes could now be scrutinized at the highest level. The suited man from earlier stepped forward then, revealing himself fully as a federal inspector traveling quietly on assignment. His presence confirmed what many passengers already suspected. This was no ordinary dispute. The inspector looked directly at the crew and said, "You've not only mishandled this situation, you've exposed your airline to serious consequences." The attendants' confidence crumbled, and murmurs of disbelief spread among the passengers. But just as the couple prepared to take their rightful seats, a final twist unfolded. The inspector leaned closer to Marcus and said in a low voice only a few could hear, "You weren't the only FAA authority on this flight. This entire route was under quiet review." Suddenly, the couple realized they had unknowingly walked into a bigger test, one that wasn't just about them, but about exposing flaws in the system itself. The flight resumed, but no one on board would forget what had happened. The lesson was clear. Respect and fairness were not optional, and sometimes the people you underestimate hold the greatest power of all. The cabin slowly began to breathe again, the tension that had wrapped itself around every seat loosening as Marcus tucked his credentials away. Alana finally sat down, her composure still intact, though inside she felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The crew, visibly shaken, avoided eye contact, their earlier authority reduced to quiet movements as they hurried to prepare for takeoff. Passengers whispered in hushed voices, the scene already spreading like wildfire among them. It wasn't every day that a first-class dispute revealed a hidden FAA authority and a federal inspector in the same cabin. As the plane lifted off the runway, Marcus leaned back, his hand resting over Alana's. She gave him a small smile, one that said everything without words. They had stood their ground, not with anger or aggression, but with patience and dignity. Across the aisle, the inspector sat silently, his eyes on his notes. The earlier flash of his badge made one thing clear: this flight had never been routine. He was here to observe, to record, and now to report. And the events that had just unfolded had given him more than enough to carry forward. The young mother with her child gave Alana a soft nod of support, as if to thank her for holding her head high when most people would have been crushed by humiliation. The teenager who had watched wide-eyed earlier pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, no doubt recording every detail he had witnessed in his mind. Even the businessman seated a row behind leaned forward and quietly said, "Respect goes a long way. Thank you for reminding all of us of that." Marcus knew the story of what happened today would not end when the plane landed. The inspector's presence meant official reports would follow, investigations would be opened, and the airline's reputation could face serious questions. But beyond the paperwork and the consequences, Marcus hoped the bigger message would spread, that no passenger should be judged on assumptions, and that fairness in the skies was just as important as safety. Alana glanced around the cabin once more, noticing how different the energy felt now. Where there had been tension and unease, there was now reflection. Passengers weren't simply watching anymore. They were thinking. They had seen firsthand how dignity could withstand pressure, how truth revealed itself even when pushed aside. And quietly, many of them seemed changed by it. As the hours passed and the flight settled into its rhythm, the couple finally allowed themselves to rest. They had faced humiliation, but in the end, they had turned it into a moment that could reshape more than just their own experience. When the plane landed, there were no dramatic outbursts, no confrontations, only quiet acknowledgement from those who had witnessed it all. Walking through the terminal, Marcus and Alana moved side by side, their steps steady, their heads high. They knew this story would travel farther than the flight itself. It would become a reminder that respect matters, that assumptions can cost more than pride, and that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who never raise their voices until it truly matters. In the end, the lesson lingered like the steady echo of the engines fading behind them. True authority isn't shown by force or arrogance. It's revealed through patience, fairness, and the courage to stand firm in the face of injustice. And for everyone who shared that flight, it was a journey they would never forget.